Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to this learning experience brought to you by Cloud Native Now. My name is Cody, and I'd love to welcome you back to Techstrong Learning. Before we get this conversation rolling, I do have just a couple of housekeeping notes I'd like to review with you. First, today's session is being recorded, so if you miss any of our discussion, perhaps you'd like to rewatch or maybe share with a friend. The on-demand recording will be made available shortly after we conclude this live session today. If you'd like to engage with us, there are a couple of options for you to do so. The first of which is the chat tab, which can be found on the right side of your screen. I'd like you to go ahead and start testing that out for us by letting us know how advanced you are in your experience with Kubernetes. Tell us a little bit about what you do with your day-to-day job. If you do have any specific questions for us, we'd like you to submit those to that Q&A tab on the right side of the screen as well. Submitting your question to the Q&A just helps us keep track and keep those in our queue. So go ahead and send in as many questions as you'd like, and we'll try to get to them all. Finally, before we close things out today, we will be giving away 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. So be sure to stick around for the duration of our conversation. So our topic is cloud native data protection, and I'm joined by Frank J. Olhorst, editor-at-large, Nigel Douglas, Senior Technical Marketing Manager at Sysdig, Eric Carter, Director of Product Marketing at Sysdig, Mark Labby, Principal of Cloud Native Product Management at Kasten by Veeam, and keeping this train on the tracks today is our very own Mike Vizard, Chief Content Officer at Techstrong Group. So to our entire panel, thank you all so much for joining us today. Mike, go ahead and take it away from here.
Thank you, Cody. Thank you all for joining us today. Normally, we start out with everybody telling us where they happen to be located in the chat session, but we're going to do something a little bit different today. We would appreciate it if you would take a couple of seconds and just type in whether or not you're already running Kubernetes in production, because we're trying to get a vibe for the audience as to how far down the path they are. We, of course, welcome beginners and experts across the range, but our panelists would like to know kind of where to lean our comments so that we don't wind up in, say, acronym city. With that, though, let's first get started with what's the current state of the thing. And so I'm going to throw my first question out to Eric. We've been talking about cloud native now for the better part of half a decade or more. And I feel at least like, everybody and his brother knows everything there is to know about this, but I still run into people who are just getting started. So what's your sense, Eric, of what is the state of cloud native at the moment? Where are we on this journey? And what's your feel for where we're going next?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Mike. My work at Sysdig, we can been born really to look at what are cloud native technologies doing, either from a security standpoint or a monitoring standpoint. And so we've had experience with customers. You use the word journey, and I think that's valid because there are folks along that spectrum. In fact, we were at an event last week, say that more and more enterprises, it's like, oh yeah, of course we're doing that. But then there are still those who are saying, oh, we're just getting started with containers and orchestration and those kind of things. At the end of the day, kind of what I see is this really about companies wanting to move faster, because if they don't, somebody's going to eat their lunch, so to speak, and from a competitive standpoint. And so by using some of these technologies like Docker containers, like orchestration to scale, like developing on a more agility, kind of with an agility basis, right? So we know there's CI/CD and all those things. Folks are just trying to change and shift how they can roll out applications in such a way that, hey, I don't have to wait. I'm not waiting for the train that leaves 6 months from now. I can roll it out tomorrow. So I think I see a lot of that. And then one reason why I think that cloud native technologies are moving further faster is there's a lot of great open source technologies and things in the ecosystem, so that I can just borrow, things that I might need to run my application as to develop the whole thing myself. And believe me, there are other reasons why folks are moving to cloud native. And again, I see it as being really about getting more competitive and making sure that we're meeting the needs of our customer, whether it's with an app or whatever it might be, right? Because if we don't, and I think about financial services, if we don't, the challenger banks are going to get our customers, or we think about Uber and cabs and those kind of things. So for me, that's a huge part of why we see the growth.
Yeah, Nigel, you want to add anything to that, since you see some of the same things? But and I guess I would ask this question in a slightly different way, but are people being smart about what they're deploying on these types of platforms, or is it still a little bit, maybe, shall we say, fashionable, and people are just kind of building stuff because somebody told them to build stuff on this, but they're discovering that maybe this one wasn't as fit for purpose as something else? So are we getting better at this?
Yeah, I definitely think we're still, like you say, following other people's practices to a point where, you read an article and you say, okay, here's how to solve a problem. And then you go ahead and you follow those instructions. What we've seen, in Sysdig, we do a threat report each year. And we always see these really crazy numbers, like 73% of containers are created with privilege set to true, or something you really shouldn't be by now still doing, like overly permissive workloads. And what often I find is when people are testing, they're quite literally going to a blog and there's, the generic template. So they copy the YAML manifest, they apply, and they go, cool, I'm doing Kubernetes right now. But they have no idea why they did it like that. They don't take security into consideration when they applied the manifest. They simply did it because, cool, I have a workload doing something it's supposed to do. Another great example I find as well that just proves the point that many organizations just aren't ready yet is you come off the back of these major events like KubeCon, and you hear the Cloud Native Compute Foundation go ahead and they build these surveys, and they find out something like, okay, everyone's using network policy. They all know what network policy is, and everyone understands the terminology like zero trust and least privilege and all of this. And then when they move to production environments, they say, how many organizations actually apply least privilege network policy? Let's say only traffic I should allow, everything else should be dropped by, default deny policy. It turns out something like 15% or less actually apply this best practice or this network design that we're all talking about. So in short, yeah, I still think it's organizations are using the technology. That cloud native is definitely here to stay. I think the point is that people are still in that stage of almost fad where they're just grabbing things and applying them. Definitely in staging, you wouldn't do this in production. You hope that people aren't doing this in production, but they're not taking security seriously when they're going through the testing and staging environments, I feel.
All right, I think we all agree that it's still relatively early days at the end of it all. But Mark, there's been this ongoing debate in the community about stateless versus stateful applications for as long as I can remember. And there are those who are saying, well, stateless, you should never store data in a Kubernetes cluster because you already have something else somewhere and it's just too hard. There are others that are saying, I don't have anything else to store my data on, so I'm going to build a stateful application and put it on a database on Kubernetes. Devil be damned, and away we go. Is this debate still happening in your mind, or have we moved past it? Because I scratch my head sometimes when I listen to the stateless argument. I'm like, the data's got to go somewhere, right?
Yes. So as we said earlier, this cloud native is a journey, and it's only a matter of where you are on the journey. Everybody gets to stateful workloads, end of story. There's nobody who's doing Kubernetes at scale who hasn't done that. And we see lots of people trying to figure out how to lift and shift into Kubernetes, just like they were lift and shifting into public cloud. I like to call this kind of cloud native watching. And so we have people lifting and shifting into KubeVirt now on top of Kubernetes to run more traditional workloads, because running on Kubernetes means that they get multi-cloud and a lot of infrastructure independence, whereas they don't have that with more traditional bare metal and VM hypervisor situations. So we've got some very large, let's just say domestic military customers who are saying, yeah, I need Kubernetes to run my VMs. A pretty strange world. It's a little upside down, but that is absolutely the reality of what Kubernetes can do. So stateful workloads is only a matter of maturity and only a matter of scale and only a matter of once you've been successful with stateless Kubernetes, yes, the next problem happens, which is growing the workloads to more use cases, and it's inevitable. So I think the CNCF survey maybe 2 years ago said about 70% of people are trying to get to databases right now on Kubernetes, and over 40% had already achieved it. So it's at the tipping point, if not already.
All right, wait. In my acronym police role, I need you to explain what KubeVirt is for the 20% of people on this that have no idea what a KubeVirt is.
KubeVirt.io is an open source project. It's a CNCF, Cloud Native Compute Foundation, open source project that helps run virtual machine workloads on top of Kubernetes. It basically uses the KVM hypervisor on top of the Linux kernel on each worker node of a Kubernetes cluster. So Kubernetes coordinates the scheduling and rollout and orchestration of VM workloads on top of it. And it is primarily stewarded by Red Hat over the last couple of years.
All right, I'm going to reach out to Frank here, who hasn't had a moment to speak, but see, that's why I have to say Frank, so he turns off the mute thing, right? Otherwise, we won't know. But Frank, you've been watching this as long as I have. What's your sense of the current state of the art? What are you hearing from IT folks that you engage with out there? I mean, is this something that, is a bottoms-up driven thing, or is this, from your perspective, the CIO standing up saying, "Thou shalt go cloud native," and we're just going to go for it and let me know how it all turns out?
Well, I think, there's a lot of push from the C-suite to look into, cloud native applications or moving that route. And, the C-suite looks at it from that point of view of, agility, cost efficiency, blah, 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 all those, those business terms that have to deal with dollars and cents. But, realistically, what we're talking about here is, the concept of going cloud native and protecting the data and garnering benefits. And, one of the things that I think a lot of folks overlook in this journey is that we're talking a lot about resiliency and flexibility. And one of the things that going this cloud native route helps with is avoiding vendor lock-in. Right now, you've got so many technologies out there that require you to commit to a particular, combination of technologies to run on a specific cloud. Moving into this world of containers and, cloud native applications gives you that flexibility that you're not married to a particular cloud provider, that you have the flexibility to go, hybrid or purely in the cloud. And when it comes to, protecting your operations, that gives you not only the resiliency, but it also can potentially eliminate that single point of failure. Because nobody wants to move into a cloud native environment and then have their apps go down for hours at a time or something like that. So, I think ultimately the driver behind this is, keeping things up and running, manageable and observable. And that manageability and observability really speaks well to the folks in IT, and that, agility and cost efficiency talks very well to the C-suite. So it can be quickly turned into a win-win scenario.
All right. Mark, let me ask you something. Since the title of this session in particular is Cloud Native Data Protection, we've been doing data protection for 4 or 5 decades now. What makes data protection in a cloud native context different? What's challenging here? What would people overlook?
So in doing application modernization to get all of the benefits that Frank wants, it's actually very hard to refactor the application. So what most people are doing is they're refactoring the infrastructure, they're refactoring and both of those to become cloud native, which means sometimes, or many a time, the traditional tools and the traditional operations and the traditional skill sets do not come along for that journey. You have to reinvent a number of these things. And in some cases, you'll find Kubernetes much more advanced because you can converge so many of the top to bottom stack concerns of application, infrastructure, operations all together. But correspondingly, when it comes to data protection, we have volume snapshots, but how do you do application consistent better than just crash consistent backups such that you have the ability to restore or do disaster recovery? And so to the earlier question, is this becoming stateful? Absolutely. Our sales have doubled in the past year, because everybody is going stateful and everybody needs to figure out how to actually protect the business running with these cloud native operations. So data protection in Kubernetes is an evolving area. In fact, we're helping lead a Kubernetes enhancement proposal with Dell and AWS and VMware and Google, a consortium of all of these large vendors to introduce change block tracking, because to do a Delta snapshot doesn't exist today right now. So we're working on that, and that's going to take a year or two maybe to finally get it done, although we'll have prototypes, we have prototypes now. But that's what it takes to move the entire industry forward. And if you're coming from bare metal and VMs and you expect that, a backup window to be 10 minutes or less, or 5 minutes or less, or 1 minute than less, no, it's going to be the former, not the latter right now, until we get to these Delta snapshots. So data protection is evolving. And there are different challenges to translate your operational skill set and into this cloud native world. Absolutely, there are challenges.
Let me ask you a follow-up to that. Was stateful kind of an afterthought in the Kubernetes TOC, and therefore we're kind of chasing after it now because they had a bias towards stateless?
Cloud native and Kubernetes are never done, and that's why we have 6-month releases and deprecation of anything 18 months old. No, this has been rolling and building and growing the capabilities nonstop. And it's very exciting. It's very disruptive to the way people think about operations. I install things and I just reboot it at best for the next 10 years. And that's the maintenance plan for it. And this is not the case. We have customers very uncomfortable with having to rip and replace Kubernetes potentially every 18 months. Now, that doesn't actually happen a lot because they are willing to mitigate, or they have vendors that will stake them. And they have Sysdig to help protect them from all the threats, but that doesn't mean that everybody's not starting to learn how to go faster, and that includes the infrastructure and the applications together.
All right, Eric, Mark brought up a point that I know you guys track, but how many versions of Kubernetes do you think people are running in their organizations? I mean, let's see, we got 112 to 127, and how many in between? And each of those things has a slightly different profile. What's going on?
Yeah, and I don't know the answer. Nigel might have a better answer, but it's many, right? And not only that, but then you've got the version that's coming from Red Hat with OpenShift, and you've got other things like that. So there's a lot of different things to keep track of. And we hope that they bump up from time to time, because there are good things that get done in the platform. You were focusing on storage. I think the idea of persistent volumes and things have been there for a while because we saw that coming. But there are additional, there are always capabilities going. It is one of the things that we have to do as well, right? We have to make sure that we're taking into account any kind of changes that might impact what we do, or that might give us a new opportunity to look at what's happening in Kubernetes from a security standpoint. There are various things that have been introduced over time that we've tried and failed. And Nigel, I'm thinking of pod security policies. It was let's find ways to not let people run things, and then that was deprecated. But I think the idea of being able to block things from running that don't meet your security standards is important, and I think we've found ways to do that. But so there are always evolutions happening, right? Is all I'll say. And we always hope customers upgrade so that we don't have to backfix things that may be broken.
Yeah, I just to add on to that, it's that a lot of people expect Kubernetes to have everything, and it doesn't. It's very much, there's a lot of stuff out of the box, but those, like RBAC, are primitives. And really, in order to get to what Eric is alluding to, which is policy-based running your business, deployments, as well as the operating state of those workloads, that's really a batteries not included experience right now. And you need to go find a vendor or an open source project or a combination thereof. And it's always a combination thereof. And then to make it work with all the other, universe of vendors and open source projects that you're running to operate your workloads on top of Kubernetes. It's really, to federate all of that is a challenge, but that's what's required. And the great news is that you can't and don't have to go only one place to get something done. If somebody's not doing it for you, well, then let's switch to this, or let's get a bake-off. And that is the co-opetition benefit of all of this, right? Because, my competitors work with me, and my competitors compete with me, and my competitors are trying to innovate on top of Kubernetes for the benefit of everybody, all at the same time. So it's a thrilling space to be in, but it's got probably more challenges than the traditional way of doing things. And I find that exciting. I wouldn't be doing this job otherwise, but we're finding that most of the world is seeing the benefits of this and joining in it.
Yeah. Nigel, I think the first time I've talked about the unification of cybersecurity and data protection, actually I happen to know this because I looked it up the other day, it was 1997. And we've been having this conversation ever since, and with minimal success and minimal progress. So then we had the ransomware attacks, which seemed to force the issues. But do you think that data protection and cybersecurity are getting more closely joined at the hip? And does that impact the way we need to think about this whole activity? What are you seeing?
Yeah, I personally think it's getting harder. And, to go back onto what we were talking about there a second ago, there's so many different versions of Kubernetes, but then there's the distributions. And even on the distribution side, whether it's managed or self-managed, you have the networking plugins that are either there by default or something you plug in. I'll give a great example. Some organizations like, let's say, a federal, a fintech organization like a bank, and they, in the US, they need to be FedRAMP compliant for the most part, if it operates within the US. So let's say you're using Istio, a service mesh technology, and you're using mutual TLS for encryption. There's other people on a managed Kubernetes distribution like an EKS, and they're using Cilium, let's say, as their networking interface. And they're using, WireGuard for encryption. There's all these promises about out of the box, you can use WireGuard, it's highly performant, it's quicker, easier to turn on and off. And then you find out the actual encryption protocol isn't FedRAMP compliant. Mm-hmm. Or there's all these implications of there's so many different options of how to configure something. And you go down the managed route and it promises you everything. You just turn it on and everything works. And that's highly, it's exciting for an end user who, let's say, they don't want to understand how the different underlying components work. They don't want to build your own Kubernetes. They want it managed by a provider. But then when they start touching on things like, native routing. So Azure will tell you, hey, you can connect to all sorts of Azure specific infrastructure via the managed AKS. But once you start choosing your service mesh or choosing your network plugin, you find out native routing suddenly kind of disabled to us. The compliance element that you're just talking about there becomes harder and harder because you might be using service mesh to meet all of the compliance requirements, like I talk about the mutual TLS, or it might be for there's so many functionality or features of it. But then you find out actually the operational overhead of managing that gets difficult. So there's this kind of horrible divide between what's the easiest way of managing Kubernetes with the lowest overhead that just gets your application out there. And then there's the compliance part. And every company is giving different encryption protocols. They're giving different ways of saying, we do consolidation and solving your problems. So I think, if anything, the data protection side of things is getting harder and harder. I mean, in general, cloud native is hard because that whole not immutability, but the ephemeral nature of workloads that compared to traditional monoliths that, they don't have static IDs, or IPs, these change very often. You can't use any of your traditional tool set. You can't just monitor based on IP. It just gets really hard. So I definitely think regarding the maintaining compliance, it's hard when you kind of plug into a managed solution to solve these problems, and then you find out actually you're not necessarily compliant anymore.
All right. Hey, Frank, speaking of compliance, do the compliance people know how to spell Kubernetes yet? Are they looking for Kubernetes? Is it kind of like, are they even aware that there's this thing happening out there? I mean, what do you think?
I think the compliance folks are just so focused on, the actual compliance laws that they're falling behind in, what the technology means and how it impacts what compliance does. Now, those that are more savvy, especially those in like the financial sector or medical sector, have much more of a clue of how data is accessed and the technologies behind it. But when you start moving off to some of the other compliance requirements or even internalized regulations for a company, they're really kind of navigating without a compass when it comes to understanding the impact that something like Kubernetes or cloud native technologies has on compliance. And that really comes down to lacking the understanding of who can access what, when, and why.
All right. So let's follow up that, Mark. Let me think. If I go back to 1997, I was supposed to be driving around in my flying car right by now, and everything was supposed to be easy. And so how do we make this whole data protection thing simpler than it is today? Because to Nigel's point, it's not easy.
It's not easy, but that's why we're working so hard to make it easier and to really commoditize all of these heavy operations and deep knowledge that's required, such that it can get to what Frank's alluded to, which is really policy-based everything, which means that you can automate everything and your business is running the way it is. But we're trying to shift left, not just development, but the operations too of those development workloads, such that they can be compliant. Now, that's really somewhat radical, but because of cloud native, we can finally talk about all of these concerns, not at the endpoint in production, but all the way in development, and even on the laptop, and even on the edge, because, well, that looks like a laptop as far as its compute resources and its networking resources and so on. So what my point is that we can finally start to address top to bottom the entire stack, the entire operations, and the entire governance of how you run your business, unlike ever before. The good news is that we can. The bad news is that it's very hard to do and requires more discipline and more disciplines interlocking and working together. And that's really hard when traditionally the storage admin did his stuff and the network admin did her stuff and the developer did their stuff. And, they threw it all over the transom to the other, right? And now in our world of DevOps and shifting left, the reality is that works in some places somewhat well and poorly in other places, and not at all in production, but only up until staging, And so again, this is the journey, but I finally am confident that we have the right place in cloud native to finally address top to bottom all of these concerns and all of the teams and all of the dimensions of a workload to make it shift left all the way from development, such that production is just another development instance in a sense. We have the ability to do that now. It's very hard to get there, but there's no doubt in my mind that every vendor and every open source project is working to accomplish this.
Right.
I worry, Mike, that we're painting a terrible picture of cloud native and like people going, forget it. But it is why solutions like, Kasten and Zistic exist to try and kind of demystify some of that and make it easier, even on the compliance side. I do think what Mark brought up is like as code, like infrastructure as code policy. Those things can be great for doing this at scale, right? It does help. It's just that with all the moving parts, which I think Nigel talked about, it can feel overwhelming and it's different. It's different than ever before. My VM that I could care and feed for, is not there anymore. So I want us to paint a positive picture, and I think it is positive. We have successful customers.
Right.
We have some that have strict things like PCI compliance. They're like, hey, how do I do that when I'm running this massive Kubernetes estate? Well, it is possible. The way I look at it is you got to have the right controls and map those to what the standard is, right? And then just be able to prove that you've done the work, right? And that's where things like persistent storage backup, all these things, and protecting that with things like watching the windows and the doors, so to speak, so that you're blocking threats or at least have an awareness. So it is all coming along. It's just that, it's a lot more complex.
If I sound pessimistic, it's because I know how hard it is, but you could not do this before. You had to do it with 10 different vendors in 10 different domains with 10 different teams. And who we see at KubeCon now, for the last, 5 or 6 years, KubeCon was mainly the developers, right? And KubeCon is the main conference for Kubernetes and cloud native. And so, but in this past year, since November, I'm seeing the data operators, I'm seeing the SOC, I'm seeing the operators now heavily trying to figure out how to do this properly. And they're confused because now everything can be in the same pie. And it's hard to work out of the same pie because now you have to work and look eye to eye to all these different domains inside your own organization, whereas before you could throw it to them. No, now it's all collaborative. And that's harder. So people are the problem more so than the technology.
Yeah, that's right.
And we have this opportunity. That's why I have so much hope, right? That's why I know we can conquer it on cloud native on the laptop with the developer all the way out to production. That's possible now, unlike ever before. It was fairly impossible unless you're a Google.
I think what we're getting at here is it's as much a process and cultural issue as it is a tech issue. So Nigel, let me ask you something. Who's in charge of this stuff now? I mean, is it we hear about the platform engineering teams, and then there's security people running around, and then there's IT ops people who are implementing data protection and security operations policies and procedures. Who's got the ball and who's leading the charge?
Yeah, it's a great comment, and especially when I used to work as a solutions architect, so I worked closely with let's say the businesses who are actually implementing this technology, and you see these new titles, and it's funny, often they're not doing the practice of their role. So like, let's say if we have a DevOps engineer, and you think of pipeline and operations, and you have some people even going towards things like DevSecOps, as in they have security in their operations and everything they're doing. But I often feel like the personas we're speaking to are these architects who ultimately handle everything, and there's no way to avoid it. As in, let's stick it on the networking part I mentioned earlier. The guy who's responsible for the networking implementation isn't a network operations center person anymore. It's like the person who's the operations. They're also the security because it's network security. You find as well that person who's, again, applying these manifests, who's, scheduling everything in their environment, creating these tasks, are now taking on responsibility of security. I'm not saying that they are head of security. They're still taking responsibilities from, you have people who are overlooking, you still have a CISO and these important roles in an organization. But what I feel like is more and more ops people are carrying the weight of more roles than maybe they were intended to originally. And that is a recurring conversation that we're having at these conferences, again, to people who are originally just playing around with Kubernetes. They're saying, look, my job is moving away from monolith to cloud native, and then found themselves this, I don't know what you would be the right term for them, these evolution teams, just doing a lot of different things. So I think DevSecOps is a very common role now, even if people aren't using that title or not. They're kind of a security operations architect of, let's say, a lot of different things within the organization.
Well, Mark, to that end, back in the day, it was data protection was given to the person lowest on the IT totem pole, and that was their job. And, they had this lovely little graphical tool, and away they went. Today, is data protection now integrated through APIs into these DevOps workflows, and is the nature of the beast changing, and what does that look like?
The nature of the beast is just more interfaces, right? We still, Kasten's part of Veeam, VBR, 12 just released, and it's still primarily a Windows VMware audience, right? For the majority of our traditional customers. But they're increasingly asking about APIs, and they're increasingly asking about Kubernetes, and they're increasingly bridging into these new worlds from their traditional worlds. So the answer is hybrid, and it's a journey, just as we've been alluding to over and over again. But we correspondingly have the developers like, I don't care about that Windows VMware stuff. I care about my cloud and an API, and tell me how you do data protection there, because I don't know how to do it. And we offer products now that back up Salesforce and Microsoft Azure itself, right? Because even they will say we can't do everything, and we don't do everything, right? So it's an evolving area, but all I do is see it's more layers. Nothing fundamentally has changed because the fundamentals are still there. It's just a matter of opening it to these new doors.
Frank, what's your sense of that question? Because sometimes I scratch my head and I go, I'm great. We got pipelines and APIs, and we run DevOps.com, and we're big believers in the whole workflow. However, I know that there are software engineers out there that occasionally just want to click a button and have something done for them and not spend time programming and writing scripts and doing all this stuff. So as a practical matter, are people kind of mixing and matching tools as they see fit, or what are you seeing out there?
Yeah, people are mixing and matching tools. But, I think the goal is where, folks want to head is this kind of, idea of a one-click deployment. And whether that means leveraging, generative AI to create those, the code or the policies or the deployment scenarios, I think that's probably where we're going to be heading towards. But when you start looking at all the little bits and pieces and the complexity under the hood, whether it's, from the security point of view, you've got security on the cloud provider. You've got, security from, the end user point of view. You've got security from the application point of view. Start throwing in things like microservices, start throwing in things like security directly for the container. And then you throw in things like dynamic workloads and how you protect those. It gets very, very complicated. And people are starting to kind of whip up these recipes that might work well for one specific example, but fail miserably for another. So, we have to move to a point where it's more unified in how not only that we manage things, but how we can deploy things. So there's some sort of commonality between it. There's so much customization needed right now that folks are just turning to all different types of tools to meet their specific needs when, in reality, their specific needs really aren't that different than other folks. They just envision that they have specific needs.
All right. I got to a whole 35 minutes before somebody mentioned generative AI. So that could be the new standing record for one of these at the moment. But Mark, what is the future of AI in this space? Do you have a sense of what's going to happen here? I mean, there's machine learning algorithms, and then there's these large language models and domain expertise. There's a lot going on. Can we reduce the toil?
I think to an extent, but we have to be cautious because AI is a tool, but it's a very much unchecked and random quality type tool. And so we're very much in the experimental phase with it and learning about it and learning how to deal with it properly. I think without a governance model around AI, it's very dangerous because people will blindly accept the outcomes, just like they might cut and paste something from Stack Overflow. If I cut and paste it from, ChatGPT, what's to guarantee that it isn't equally random? So as far as the outcome and as far as your security and as far as your posture, and now Sysdig will warn you, oh, well, you cut and paste the wrong thing. So that's the reality, right? It's another tool, but when it works, I mean, maybe this is still a 5% type scenario. It's pretty astounding. I mean, I get blown away and be like, wow, I wish I had that. So it has incredible potential, but what is AI for the most part? It's the best pattern matching machine ever right now. And that tool can be adapted to almost anything, to clicks, to APIs, to coding, not equally well, but maybe we can feed this enough such that it does get better. But every time you cut and paste something into an AI, that's intellectual property. That is business secrets. And so I don't play with it except for on my home laptop because my work, I'm going to create a barrier between our business intellectual property and experimentation. And that is the most cautious tale I'll give right now, because unless you are a domain expert, you don't know what you're cutting and pasting back that you hoped AI would provide for you. We're not there yet.
All right. Aaron, do you feel similar to that?
Yeah, I was going to say this is fresh on my mind because through our partnership with Google, we made a kind of a forward-looking announcement last week, but we would be, possibly, developing with their Vertex AI, right? But there's so many of these options out there. And in fact, we are. I don't know about you, Mike, but it feels like, for about at least 5 years, everyone's have used either ML or AI and sort of washed their products. And it's not, we're in a different place now. Like this stuff seems very real. One of the things I saw, one of our tech guys do is say, let me see how good AI would be as a Falco engineer. And Falco is our open source threat detection engine. It said, write me a rule that will, in the Falco syntax, that would detect X, Y, and Z. And out the other side came some pretty decent detections, that were sourced by ChatGPT. So it's like interesting, how can we harness some of that more than just having it as like a chat bot that tells me what your documentation says in plain English. It's like, how do we use it to help people respond, maybe to understand what's the latest threats that are happening that I should be aware of, kind of like the job that the MITRE folks do with the MITRE attack framework, but like getting it, hot off the press, so to speak. So there's a lot of things that could be done, and we're working at it as more than a chat bot. But so I am fascinated by the science. I'm not smart enough to dig into it. In fact, people are telling me that I'm being too easy on ChatGPT by simply saying, tell me about X. They're like, no, make that multidimensional and tell it to produce something for you. And that's much. So I think I don't even know the scope of it, but I think it can be helpful especially we talked about a lot of complexity, especially if it can, I don't know if this is a real word, but decomplexify some of the stuff we're facing in cloud.
Commoditize.
Yeah.
Nigel, what do you think? Can I ask ChatGPT to write me a runbook to back up versions 1 through 22 of Kubernetes with this stack on top of it, and it'll just kind of kick me out a playbook, or what?
Yeah, in fact, ChatGPT, it's like Mark alluded to earlier, like you wouldn't blindly trust it for everything because things are going to break. I mean, it's a language model, but it's not a human making conscious decisions. Saying that, I think what it does really well at is things like language, obviously, what it's intended for. So things like, let's put an example, you have a YAML manifest for some deployment. I think if you asked it some generic task, I mean, you have an autopilot that says, reformat incorrectly formatted YAML manifest, some monotonous task that no one actually enjoys doing and wastes time doing this. It's great for fixing those issues. But going back to what Mark said, I think where the issues come from stuff like that is if you have sensitive credentials and you expose those in the deployment, or any manifest for that matter, and it goes through the engine, like what are the guardrails in regards to obfuscating sensitive data, usernames, passwords, secrets, these kind of things? I don't think anyone's really cares about that right now. So we always say, don't expose sensitive credentials, don't post secrets in GitHub repositories. And yet you're happily just giving it away to a language model. So probably there needs to be a lot more legislation for sure around how to handle sensitive data that might end up in these files and how to remove it, more importantly, like a GDPR, but for AI. But saying that, the thing that I would say is the best value for it and where I can see it adding huge value for cloud native is, again, misformatting. It seems like the most common thing that comes up in Stack Overflow. I think I used this CloudFormation template, but it's not working. Can you tell me why? And someone said, I don't know, you can't use that semicolon. You can't use this blank space there at the end of a line. Stupid things that we all waste time doing. I think that will revolutionize and certainly improve how we do work.
All right. Frank, in this language of acronyms that we throw around, there's a relatively new one floating around called a CNAPP, which is a Cloud Native Application Protection Platform. How cloud native those things are arguably might be in the eye of the beholder, but I guess, what do you think of a CNAPP? What is it? Are we going to unify a lot of processes around it? And to that extent, I know Gartner kind of coined the term, but from your perspective, where are we on the shift to CNAPP type of things?
The problem with CNAPP, especially as an acronym, it really, breeds more acronyms, whether it's CSPM, which is, posture management. You've got CWPP, which is workload protection. You've got, the concept of having continuous integration, continuous deployment involved. And then you've got, cloud infrastructure and title management thrown on top of all of that. So, the basic concept behind CNAPP is to build right in to your cloud native, infrastructure, your protection, to build it right in. It becomes a level of orchestration and components that are supposed to keep everything secure. The problem that you see out there with CNAP is that it can't possibly cover everything at any given point in time. You adhere to what CNAP says to do, and oh no, you find that there is a hole still in the system. So I think there's a lot more work that needs to be done to be able to bring across this concept of a one-size-fits-all way of securing things when you're moving into the cloud. And, the deeper we get into this and the more we automate it, the more things we find are missing. And usually we find those things missing a little too late. And that's where the challenge lies. I mean, there's a big push behind CNAP or something like it. Whether or not we're going to get there anywhere in the near future, that's really the big question right now.
Eric, you want to jump in on that one?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of those things we talk about, is this market, hit a maturity level or not? And it sort of depends. On the CNAP side, we have had customers start to say, geez, do I have to buy 5 different tools to get there? Or can you start to consolidate some of this for us, right? We've had some success there. I'll talk like Nigel. We fancy ourselves a CNAP. But what does that mean, right? Because you are combining all these acronyms. But again, customers are simply saying, yeah, I got GuardDuty over here doing this for me, and Sysdig over here doing that for me, and some other tool doing vulnerability management. Can I get us all working together so that I have insights across all? I think that's the goal. And again, some customers are there, and some are still just trying to figure out the posture side, right? But like other things that we've seen in this industry, things start to move together, right? And if cloud security is the big umbrella, don't make me have 6 tools, right? And to the extent that we can get there, that's, I think, what this whole CNAP thing seems to be about. And, over time, even at Assisted, customers kept saying, well, can't you just do this other thing for me? Can't you just scan my images for me? Or can't you just check my compliance posture? Or can't you just, you know what I mean? And that by necessity, we want to meet the needs of the customer, has driven us as a company in that direction. And I think that's what's happening.
All right. I think Nigel is thinking that might arguably be the worst Irish accent I've heard since Julia Roberts brought up in a Michael Collins movie.
Musical journey.
But as we think about that, though, right? And I guess I'll throw this over to Nigel to kind of complete the thought, though. But the economics of data protection are changing, and is that forcing us down some sort of centralization path, whether we wind up calling it a CNAP or whatever it is. But we've had all these point products in security. We've had them all in data protection. Are we at some sort of inflection point where we need to bring all this stuff together so we can create this kind of unified workflow? And what does that look like?
Yeah, it's a tough one, and as well as the economic decision making, is that obviously consolidation matters, and that's why organizations like Gartner have gone to the effort of building out this proposition, this definition of CNAP, and why you need to have shift left, you need shift right, you need to have end-to-end scope, and you need agents and agentless, and all of the criteria that makes CNAP a thing. It's also kind of confusing, let's say, from a cost perspective for some of the organizations that do cloud native differently. I'll give an example. Let's say if you were in Germany, data regulations are different than, the US. So they're far more strict for the most part. So often what a lot of organizations is doing is they're running cloud native. They have containers, they have Kubernetes, but it's all running in air-gapped environments. It doesn't talk to the same potential endpoints that, let's say, all of your, other cloud native endpoints do. So a lot of the things that make CNAP a thing, like agentless detection, they might say, well, when am I ever going to connect to an external SaaS platform anyway? Because it's all, highly sensitive, air-gapped, cut off from the public internet. So, there are these economic decisions on how much is it going to cost to make CNAP or to have all these consolidated tools. But then you have organizations, like I say, a lot of them that are cloud native, who just can't even justify having all these consolidated tools. Like they might not be looking at data protection the same way other organizations are, because they say, you know, a lot of those regulation tick boxes I already meet by just cutting myself off from public internet. So I think there's a lot of conversations still need to be made for like how people do cloud native, because there are so many different ways of doing cloud native, by the way, that it's not a generalized situation that I think analysts tend to put everyone into. Like for sure, most, you know, federal organizations, heavy banks that have millions of microservices, they are usually doing it the same way. But I think a lot of organizations are saying, look, we can tick our boxes and we don't need to pay for all these tools. And I think that's where a bit of confusion comes from. But for the most part, CNAP, it makes it cheaper. I think Eric talked about it a while ago. You would have had to buy a bunch of sporadic tools to solve problems, or to save money, you have a bunch of open source tools, which solves the problem, but then the management is the difficult part. So I think, yeah, when it comes to compliance, cost, all of it, it's surely cheaper to have a consolidated solution, at least to the current definition of what CNAP solves.
Okay. So Mark, we've kind of...
I would like to call out one comment. Sorry for interrupting.
These
I think
are...
it's brilliant.
No, go right ahead.
Right. I love the last sentence. It's basically saying CNAP should help in correlating all events and get better insights. That should be the goal, right? Beyond just, I like consolidating tools as well, but we just want to get more effective. So if that can be what CNAP is all about, that to me makes the best sense.
Something that makes me better than I was yesterday. Okay, I'm with you. Mark, so we had a question early on from one of the participants, and I kind of held it till now because I wanted to, frame the conversation a little bit before we got into it. But so from your perspective, what are the key feature abilities of a cloud native data protection solution? What should people be looking for? What is the thing that I need to get? Because I think a lot of people, now they understand the problem, they're like, okay, well, tell me what I got to do to fix this.
It depends on the customer's maturity and the workloads always. But having said that, the earliest level of maturity is lifting and shifting workloads into Kubernetes and give me a GUI. And certainly, so you need to have basically people who are comfortable with clicking, traditional operators able to enter into the cloud native world. The second thing is that everything has to have cloud native operations and characteristics. That means the ability to automate it, the ability to have APIs, the ability to have cloud native operations. That means the applications themselves should be cloud native and take advantage of cloud native. That means they can scale up and scale down. They should have least privilege scenarios, rootless containers, and so on, all that good stuff. FIPS if you're really good at it, and that's a journey that we're on right now. We're getting better and better at it. But that's the second stage, having all of those cloud native capabilities. And then the third stage is what we've been alluding to here and the CNAP discussion as well, is how do you drive this automation by policy such that you can't do things wrong, or at least you will get the warnings, or at least you'll learn how to get things right, because we finally put the guardrails for how the business is run, how every deployment is done, and then how every deployment is operated. Right? Does it have the right amount of backups? Does it have is it disaster recovery available in 20 minutes to keep the business up and running? Right? So it's those levels of maturity that all data protection has to give. It has to have the ability to work on all those different types of workloads, and there's so many of them. And we talked about even VMs on Kubernetes with KubeVirt. That's an evolving space. How to orchestrate that and back it up and make it migrate it, it's hard. But tying into all of these security providers, right? Outputting Prometheus logs and doing OTel, right? Being part of being a good actor in the security universe is also just as important, because to get to this enterprise management world, to make the SOC and the NOC happy and make a managed service provider want to offer your software to their customers, that's also the world that we live in. And again, that's how we get to these platform ops type outcomes that everybody wants. Just give me self-service this and one click that. I don't care that it's cloud native and APIs and scalable and disaster recovery behind it. As long as that's already driven by policy behind the scenes, that's how we get a lot to this world. And CNAP is protecting it. Then we've done our job of shifting everything, right? But we can get there, and we are getting there for our customers.
All right. Eric, you want to add to that?
Not really, but then we're done, said no one ever.
Yes. And we're out of jobs. AI does it for us. No, I don't think that'll ever be the case, because who's going to teach AI? So,
Frank, let me ask you a quick question here. Do you think that people are being held more accountable for successful backup and recovery? Because, there was a time where, people kind of backed stuff up and then they forgot about it and then they went to recover it. And, well, if it worked, it worked. It didn't work, it was a shame. But, it wasn't like a career-threatening event. Is that today now a career-threatening event?
Well, this really talks about, the concept of shared responsibility when it comes to going the cloud native route. People seem to, carve out their fiefdoms of what they're responsible for, but in the end, they have to collaborate to be able to ensure that, a system is either going to stay up and running, or they're going to be able to recover from a major event. And that, of course, requires, injecting some observability into the situation to make sure things are happening the way that they are supposed to be happening, throwing a little bit of security on top of that observability to be able to detect any type of threats or to detect any type of potential failures. And you get into the situation where you have to be a little predictive of what the worst case scenario can be. If you're not thinking about the things that can go wrong, those will be the things that ultimately go wrong. So there actually has to be a level of responsibility assigned to either a group or individuals to make sure that happens. But that requires oversight as well. So, we're at a point in time where finger pointing is not going to save your job. We're at a point in time where you have to, take responsibility, and you have to be aware of what your responsibility is. And that's the only way we're going to solve some of these problems. Now, whether or not people want to, work with that level of responsibility, that's going to be a whole nother question, because some people might want to be like, no, I don't want to deal with that. I don't want to be in command here. And, that's the other threat. Where are we going to find the people that are willing to take on this level of responsibility and, base their, their success at their job on that level of responsibility, and make sure that they have the tools that they're able to have that level of responsibility.
Yeah.
All right,
if I can
guys.
answer that, Frank, may I, Mike?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
So the golden rule we know in backups is 3-2-1. 3 online copies, 2 different locations, 1 offline, right? That's the 3-2-1 rule, briefly summarized. And correspondingly, as Frank is saying, you're only good as not your backup. You're only good as your last recovery. And even more importantly, you're only good as your last disaster recovery drill. I've worked in HIPAA, healthcare orientation operation. We had to do DR every 6 months. So again, did we ever run our sysdig scans on our DR? We should have. Did we? Is our DR as good as our production? How could it not be? Right? So there's always more to be done. But the fact that I can summarize the entire journey that every business needs to take and has to take, don't get me wrong, has to take in order to keep it up and running and be responsible and guard against the threats, even in DR. Because we can state that in 1 or 2 sentences, this is achievable. This is not unknowable, and finger pointing won't last anymore. We're all finally in the same place.
All right, guys, we got to close it out from here. I'm going to kick it back to Cody. I would just remind everybody, as one great Irishman named Murphy once said, if it can go wrong, it will. Plan accordingly. Cody, take us out.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Mike. And to our panel, thanks so much for joining us today. It really, really means a lot having everyone on Techstrong Learning with us, and I hope that we provided an excellent overview for our audience today. So thank you all so much for your time. I would like to remind our audience today that our session was recorded. So should you want to rewatch this, you will be receiving an email with a link to access the recording on demand. Of course, you can also find it living on the Cloud Native Now website at cloudnativenow.com/webinars, and be sure to look in the on-demand section. The 4 winners of our $25 Amazon gift card drawing are Prerna S., Felipe B., Christina S., and Anirban P. So to our 4 winners, congratulations. Keep an eye on your inbox to claim your gift card. It should make its way to you in the next 48 hours. If you don't happen to see that email, check your spam folder just in case it happens to be filtered out. And we do have just one last request for everyone here on the line with us, is we want you to stick around for just one more second to fill out a post-webinar survey that will pop up. As soon as I close things out, it will pop up on your screen, and we really do want to hear what your thoughts were on today's program or any suggestion for upcoming programs. Let us know there. Either way, we do hope to see everyone at a future Techstrong learning experience. Have a great rest of your day, and to our panel, thank y'all once more for joining us.